Vendetti. Some of you may know me, some of you not. I'm on the Kingston Historical Commission. I was part of the Kingston 300 book incorporated. That beautiful book that hopefully some of you were able to get. I was one of the directors, along with two other splendid people who I worked with. Ken being one of them, who was here tonight, and Matt. And also, I'm the archivist of First Parish Church. I taught in Rockland for 40 years. I'm a resident of Kingston, but I've only been a resident here for about 32 years. So not like a townie. However, I was a member of First Parish Church for about 38 years here in Kingston. And when I got in there, I realized, wow, it was lovely antique. It was all these elder people telling me stories of Kingston, and I'm saying, wow, that's really cool. And I really got into the history of the town starting at that time because of the elders at First Parish Church. When I came into town, by the way, I noticed a seal, and I didn't think anything of it at all. I thought, well, yeah, there's Kingston, Massachusetts, incorporated in 1726, and the boat, well, yeah, they made boats. They told me they made boats down there, and Independence, well, of course, the Revolutionary War and everything. And then I looked at it a little closer, and I saw Brig. I had no idea what a brig was. So I looked it up, and I find out what was a Revolutionary War vessel. And of course, as time went on, I got a little more interested in finding out more about it, the Independence. It's been very difficult to find out information about it. I looked through all the great history books. I went to all of Kingston. I went through historians like Emily Drew, Thomas Bradford Drew, Doris Johnson's book, and I didn't find an awful lot. Sarah de Normandy Bailey wrote a lot. I mentions about it. What happened? What happened to the crew? Who was the crew? When were they, hired to go off on the boat? What was the purpose of the ship, and so on? So what I'm going to try to say to you is, I really try, in the words of Louis Agassiz, who was a great teacher at Harvard of natural science. He said, never try to teach what you yourself do not know and know well. Well, I don't know if I really know well the story of independence, but I will share with you what I have found out, my findings. Well, this seal, of course, was commissioned by the town in 1952 from Helen Foster, who was a commercial artist. The town liked it so much, the next year in 53, that became the seal of Kingston. And it's kind of a part of us, okay? And made us bigger than Virginia, okay? And we had a huge coastline. All the inlets and the coves and the islands, all the way from Canada down to Nantucket. It was huge. So naturally, Massachusetts became a seafaring place, of fishing, commerce, so on and so forth. And Kingston was, from the very earliest times, a boat building place down at the landing. Okay. The next thing I want you to keep in mind is Massachusetts went to war 14 months before the Declaration of Independence. We were at war with the most powerful military on earth. Think of it. Massachusetts? Yeah, it was. And I'll give you some of the figures. April 1775, Battle of Concord, Lexington. Now, that wasn't just a group of farmers who got together. Every town had a militia, including Kingston. Our militia used to train down at the Green. Peleg Wadsworth, a Kingston teacher, was the leader of the Kingston militia. The day after the Battle of Concord, Lexington, they met on the Green and off they go to Marshfield, armed and ready to go. Fortunately, the British evacuated Marshfield, and before Peleg got there, okay? That's in March 1776. Remember, the British there was the siege of Boston. The British were all in Boston. You know, they didn't want to come out. You know, they were just surrounded, you know, by patriots. And so Washington sent General Knox off to Fort Ticonderoga, and they brought the cannons right across Massachusetts. And our own General John Thomas, who lived in that house right up practically across the street from the Mexican restaurant on Route 3 near the highway, right? General John Thomas, who was a doctor. And one night, all the cannons were brought up the hill, okay, quietly, okay? Fortifications were developed. 300 teams of oxen. Can you imagine that? All bringing up. And I've heard from 2,000 to 3,000 patriots were there. And when the British woke up, and the cannons were pointed down at their navy, they evacuated Boston about a week later, never to return to the city. So you see, Massachusetts was part of the war. Washington, by the way, left Massachusetts in April of 1776 on the way to New York. And that terrible, ill-fated campaign which occurred around the time of the Revolution. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later why I'm really telling you this. Okay? Or one other thing, okay, that I want to talk about is, what does July 4th, 1776 really mean? Now, there's a historian, Joseph Ellis. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of his books. Great historian, wonderful, wonderful writer. He taught at Mount Holyoke for decades. And he talks about Lincoln's great error. You know, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Ellis says, no, they didn't. There was no nation was created. Okay? The Declaration of Independence was a declaration of sovereign colonies. Okay? The people of Virginia had no relationship with the people of Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson used to say, Virginia is my country. And John Adams used to say, Massachusetts is my country. We were separate countries. Yes, we were the United States, but kind of like, European Union in a way. You know, we were separate countries for another 13 years until we had a constitution, and then we became one nation. Singular, United States, you know. And so I suppose when I'm telling you all of this is because Massachusetts created a naval militia of its own, okay, on its own dime, okay. Now, it was created by basically two people, James Warren of Plymouth. He was on the Massachusetts Council. The Massachusetts Council was like a legislature that met, that represented the towns in Massachusetts. And William Seaver, our own William Seaver here, who lived on Linden Street, both very wealthy businessmen. And they were the elders of the Massachusetts Council and would take turns being the president of Massachusetts. And that would only last maybe for 1 month, and then another elder would take over, be president of Massachusetts. So I'll just read a few things which are kind of important. In November of 1775, by the way, James Warren was the husband of Mercy Otis Warren, one of the great patriots, one of the great thinkers of the Revolution, and best friends with Abigail Adams, I guess, two of the great thinkers of the American Revolution. So Warren writes to Adams, we've not practiced privateering so much here as they have in some other colonies. Ships might be difficult to find. They could mount 20 guns or upward, but vessels to carry 6 to 16 guns, I think we abound in. He goes on to say, fellows can be found who have been masters of vessels. I have one, Captain Simeon Sampson, in my employ, who has served in both. So that's the first mention of Simeon Sampson in regard to this so-called privateering. Now, the Independence was not a privateer. A privateer is a privately owned boat that goes out, and it's kind of like a pirate. And they take over another boat and bring it on in and get all their stuff, and so occasionally you hear of these privateers. They weren't. They were distinct from that. Okay. Now in December of 1775, the Massachusetts Council planned to fitting out one or more armed vessels for the defense of American liberty. Okay. A month later, in January 1776, it was decided by the council that 5 armed vessels, the brigantine building at Kingston to be called Independence, the brigantine built in Dartmouth to be called the Rising Empire, another ship will be the Tyrannicide. What a great name, Tyrannicide. Ooh. And then the Republic and the Freedom and so on. So there were 5 ships that were built. The largest one was the Independence. Okay. And it turned out it was built here in Kingston because of the influence of William Seaver, of course. He wanted the boat to come to town, and it was built in the Drew shipyard. I mean, he lived a stone's throw from the Drew shipyard, so of course he'd have it built down there. He also managed all the finances and so on and so forth. Can we see number 2? Here's a picture of the model. The model's right out there. Brigantines basically had 2 main sails. I understand that there are some fine points about brigantines that are beyond me, but the way I look at it is my primitive knowledge of boats and ships, that it has 2 masts, rather. And one little problem, that American flag, that flag had not yet been created. But you know, the person who built this model certainly had good intentions. Can we see the next picture? This is another brigantine, which is a little bit more closer, I think, to what the Independence would be like. You can see the guns are on the main deck. You can, I don't know if I can see swivel guns or not, but we'll get to that in a while. We'll be on the rail. But I took that picture up in Halifax at the Maritime Museum in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now, those weird fingers moving down is a reflection of my hand on the glass. It's not meant to be part of the picture. And that's the HMS Brig Phantom. Okay. Now the Independence was 120 tons, 2 masts, would have a crew of about 100 men and boys. I have counted 7 boys included in this venture. The armaments, 12 swivel guns, and I wonder if, yes, maybe you could show number 4, Nick? That's a swivel gun. That was also taken in Nova Scotia. That would be located on the rail, and it was like a glorified shotgun. It was huge, about a yard long. Okay, and you can imagine what that thing was like. It was an anti-personnel weapon, basically, you know. And there were 12, okay, 6 on each side of the Independence, and there were 14 cannon, okay. Again, 7 on both sides of the Independence on the deck, okay, not below the deck. These things would be on the deck. Okay, I have a whole list of what they would have, you know, the powder, half a ton of powder, 100 double head shot, 26-pound shot. I don't know what that all means exactly, but they had a whole list, 40 cutlasses. You can imagine that? A lot of the weapons belonged to the sailors, by the way. And we know this because after they were in prison, their weapons were taken away. In about 2 years after they were, brought out of captivity, Captain Sampson represented them from the Massachusetts Council asking that their weapons be that they be paid off so they can buy their weapons again, their blocks and their pistols and their cutlasses and things like that. Can we see number 5? Now we talked about the flag of the it's on the model. Well, that's the flag of the Massachusetts Naval Militia. It's a pine tree flag. And some of them said "Appeal to Heaven" on the bottom. I'm not sure which the independents would have. Unfortunately, some crazy militias throughout the country enjoy waving this flag, not knowing at all its significance in history. All right, now the other thing I want to talk to is called the Court of Captures. Okay. Now, the naval militia would go out, would find a boat, maybe a British boat, going from Jamaica perhaps to Halifax, to the wrong, or across Wales. They'd capture the boat, they'd bring it back into port, either to Boston or Plymouth or Chatham, okay? And they would be what is called the Court of Captures. And William Seaver was one of the judges on the Court of Captures for Plymouth and South. And it would, they'd go through, this boat, where did this boat come from, so on and so forth, and they would divide the value of what they, including the boat. They would divide that. Half of it would go to the Massachusetts Council. The other half would go to the captain and the crew. Of course, the captain would get the larger sum. The crew would get, depending upon their station on the crew, would get a lower sum. And the boys actually would get something, very, very little. The boys didn't make out so well on the Court of Captures. And I see that the next one is, unfortunately, there are no paintings or drawings of Captain Sampson. This may be authentic. I do not know for sure, and I'll tell you why a little bit later in the talk, but that could very well be Simeon Sampson. And okay, so he was selected to command the Independence. Now, Sampson was born in Kingston, raised here, and married here, but he moved down to Plymouth. He got a job, with Warren, and with other, ships going out of town. Kingston was not so much a port as was, and so he worked down there. One interesting story about him. In 1760, he was in a boat captured by the French off the coast of Canada. Okay? He was in prison. The boat was impounded. Eventually, the boat was Eventually, the boat was returned, but some of the prisoners were kept hostage for, money, to redeem them. And he was only a boy. He was about 18 years old. And he was married at the time, by the way. And apparently, he befriended the young lady who would bring food to his cell and to the cells of the other prisoners. And he asked the young lady if she would please bring him a dress. You know what happened? He dressed up in the female dress and a bonnet or whatever he had. Quietly was able to get out of the cell. He made his way to freedom that way. I mean, it's kind of an interesting story. Now, is it apocryphal? Maybe. This is printed in several places. I don't know if there's any first-hand accounts, but it is an interesting story anyway. Now, commissions and orders. Become a captain, you have to be commissioned. And he was the first of the Massachusetts Naval Militia to be commissioned. And I'll read a little bit because it gives an idea of the responsibilities that the Massachusetts Congress expected of their captains. Okay. He is to be given full power with such persons as you shall engage in your assistance by force of arms to attack, seize, and take ships and other vessels belonging to the inhabitants of Great Britain on the high seas, and to bring the same to some convenient port in the colony. That was his commission. Now, his orders were as follows. You are directed, the order would have been in July of 1776, just after the Declaration of Independence. You are directed immediately to proceed on a cruise, not only against our unnatural enemies, but also for the protection of the trade of the United States, always using every necessary precaution to prevent the brig under your command from falling into the hands of our enemies. That did not work out for Captain Sampson. And whereas you have received a commission by force of arms to attack, seize, take on the high seas all ships and other vessels belonging to the inhabitants of Great Britain and others infesting the sea coasts of this continent. Wow, they were quite harsh, I guess. All told, I told you that the crew would be about 100. All told, I found about 131 people having served. Definitely. There's a few I'm not certain about. And I got those out of Massachusetts, Soldiers and Sailors of the American Revolution. It's like a 15-volume set of everybody that they know who served, and this was done quite a long time ago. Okay, the first cruise was a training cruise in July to Falmouth, Maine. The first engagement, there were only 2 engagements. Now, they use the word engagement. Basically, that means like a mission. They go out and they try to pick up 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, and bring them back. And then they rearm, maybe change the crews, do whatever, maybe make a repair on the boat, who knows what. But there were only 2 engagements. Now, the first engagement was, again, July, right after the training, he captured 4 merchant vessels, including the British sloop Navy, carrying rum and sugar from Jamaica to Nova Scotia. Yeah, not bad. An Irish brigantine, no information about that I could find. The Roebuck, that was captained by Gideon White Jr., who was the master, he was the captain of that boat. Now, he was a Plymouth resident, okay? And he was arrested immediately when they brought him in. He was a Tory, he was a traitor, So they put him in jail. His father pleaded that he come and stay at home with him, to keep him in his home. Eventually, Gideon left, like so many other Tories, to Nova Scotia. And I don't think he ever came back. Oh, by the way, he was an outspoken Tory, and he served at the Battle of Bunker Hill on the wrong side. So you can see he was not well liked by Massachusetts patriots. And the last boat, the 4th, was the Elizabeth, and the captain was Thomas Ludlow. And this is kind of a sad story. He had his whole family with him, wife and 7 children. He was traveling from Jamaica. I'm not sure what was on board. He was captured. The ship was brought into the court of captures, and they were detained. The word is detained. Now, I'm not sure whether that means he was jailed or his family was jailed, but they were detained. All of their possessions gone. Winter came in, and Ludlow managed to have a word with the court asking that some of his things be returned, but they only returned clothing and blankets and necessities to get them through the winter. Whatever happened to Ludlow and his family, I do not know. Now for the second and final engagement. That was on September 24th, 1776. Now, the books I've seen say, well, yeah, 3 or 4 prizes. I can only discover 2. One was the brigantine Nancy with a valuable cargo of whale oil and 75 Irish passengers. Okay? The first lieutenant, Daniel Adams, was assigned by Sampson to be the captain of the boat and bring that prize into, and I think Boston is where that prize went to. They had to decide what to do with the Irish citizens. Some of them apparently decided to stay in Massachusetts. Others wanted to go home, and I think arrangements eventually were made to do that. And so Captain Lieutenant Charles Dyer advanced to first lieutenant. Okay, so he took over Daniel Adams' place as second in command. Basically, the only other engagement I know about is the Ranger. Okay, that would be number 2. Kind of a funny story there. The Ranger was not the boat that was taken, it was the Billy. The Ranger was a privateer, a real privateer. It took over the Billy. Okay. A number of sailors from the Ranger went on to the Billy. Okay. There was a bad storm. The Ranger went off out of sight. The people of the Billy had an uprising. They subdued the Ranger sailors, and they continued on their way to Ireland, where they were headed. Well, along comes Samson, sees what's going on, and he takes the boat. He relieves the former sailors of the Ranger and says, "How would you like a job?" And so he took them on, and they brought the Billy back into Plymouth as a prize. Now for the defeat of the brigantine Independence. That was on November 24th, 1776. Now, he was off the coast of Nova Scotia. He was way, way up, okay, into the north. He encountered a 14-gun British sloop called the HMS Hope, commanded by a Captain George Dawson. Okay, and now, but remember, he was under orders not to allow his boat to be captured. He noticed not only was there the Hope, but there was another vessel there too. It was a troop carrier, and he turned around and tried to move on, but he was not fast enough. The Hope was able to overtake the Independence, and unfortunately, a battle ensued. And I'll give you some of the details of that. The troop transport was called the Nancy. Why can't they have different names for boats? I don't know why, but the Nancy was there. Here's a newspaper article from the Independent Chronicle of Boston describing what happened. Okay, the brig Independence in the service of the state, commanded by Captain Sampson, was lately taken by George Dawson, master of the HMS Hope, in company with a transport, the HMS Nancy, after a snot engagement, and carried into Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia. Okay, the brig engaged Dawson for near 2 hours. You can imagine. It must have been pretty bad, I'll tell you. It goes on to say something which you may have heard about before, apparently it was such an overwhelming battle that one of the companies that were in charge of the cannon withdrew. And of course, Sampson saying, "Get back and do your job." And one report is that he shot them. Okay, there were 3 people on the cannon. He shot them. Now, I don't know if I believe that, because I mean, if you shot him with a pistol, you would have to have 3 pistols, right? 1, 2, 3. I don't think so. I doubt if he did that, because there's another report that says that he ran them through with his sword, and that sounds a little more likely. But can I tell you that in the soldiers and sailors of the American Revolution, there's no notice of that happening. None of the sailors on board. I can't find out any names. So you wonder, again, is it apocryphal? I do not know. I cannot tell you that. Here is a letter that I'll read by Sampson himself to the Massachusetts Council regarding the defeat. Halifax Harbor, on board the Bologna guard ship. This is where they were kept, on a ship. Mind you, this is January, and these were derelict ships that weren't used for anything else. These were prison ships. They were horrible. Okay? He says, "Gentlemen, on the 25th of November last, we fell in with a sloop of war called the Hope at 16 guns, upward of 100 men, commanded by George Dawson and the Nancy transport with 16 guns and 60 men. Soon came to action, with the Hope and the Nancy lying off at a distance of half a mile. But the officer on board the Nancy, seeing the attack of the Hope closely for more than an hour, came up and engaged me on the larboard quarter. At the same time, the Hope on my starboard beam." So he had two ships on either side of him. There was simply no hope. He says that my rigging and sails in a shattered condition and miserable, the enemy outsailed me, came up, and after making a running fight for some time, was under the disagreeable nicety of submitting. Okay. Now, the number of people who died, I do have some names of some people who died during the battle. Sampson says here that some men were killed in the engagement and 7 were wounded, 2 of whom have since died of their wounds. And I do have names. Now the imprisonment. And this is the thing that shocked me. We all know that it didn't work out for the independence, but this was the most inhumane that you can imagine, okay? Here's the second letter to the Massachusetts Council, okay? "We are all in number on board 100 and in general in an deplorable situation, having been robbed of most of our clothing by the different ships we were taken by. One of my men was froze to death the 13th instant, and there is about 40 more froze, some badly, 4 sent to the hospital, one of which so badly froze, 'tis thought he will lose both his legs. The ship we are aboard of is old." This is strange, the way he writes, okay? "Old, open, and leaky. It is the inclemency of the season, short of provisions and necessaries of life. Shan't think strange if many of us should not survive until the opening of spring, except some member can be taken to exchange the passengers." Now, there were escape attempts. And I was able to find these actually by going through pension records of some of the sailors, because they would have to prove what they did in order to get a pension. And here is one written by, let's see if I can find his name. Well, I can't find his name right now. Oh, Samuel Noel, interesting character. He was one of the, a patriot of the Boston Tea Party, believe it or not. But so he writes, some of the people were brought to Fort Cumberland, which was basically like a castle or a fort. He talks by digging a subterranean passage extending from under the room beyond the walls of the prison. "We should have completely succeeded in emancipating ourselves, but for the treachery of one Knowles. He disclosed to the keeper of our prison of our plan and progress. This fatal disclosure thwarted and blighted every prospect of escape." There was a problem of exchanges. Massachusetts didn't have enough prisoners of value or enough prisoners, period, to make an exchange with the English. So Massachusetts actually asked other governors, or governors, I don't know, other leaders from other states to see if they could make a deal to get some for exchanges. And exchanges were made. The first exchange was March 1777, okay, freeing a fellow named Cotton, who was a prize master, and surgeon's mate, Samuel Gilbert, and maybe others. The second of the exchanges actually included Captain Sampson himself. That was in July of 1777, and Lieutenant Dyer. They both got out. Now, we've all heard of the mutiny on the Bounty, right? Well, there was a mutiny on the Royal Bounty, okay? In January of 1778, a huge number of prisoners were exchanged, not exchanged, I'm sorry, no, I'm wrong here. A huge number of prisoners were to be transported to New York for possible exchange. It would be easier that way. Okay, so you have about 300 people on a ship called the Royal Bounty. Now, this ship was, again, similar to the Ranger. It was being accompanied by another ship while it was storming. Blew up, and the ships became separated from each other. And, well, you got like 300 guys on this boat who've been in prison for God knows how many years. They rose up, they took over the ship entirely and sent it into Marbleton. And I'm not sure exactly what happened to those poor people, but my assumption is they were all free and certainly deserved after what they had been through. Now, what happened to the Independence? For sure, I don't know. However, we do know this, that last Friday, this is March 21, 1777, okay, arrived at a safe port, the Brig, Independence. It was brought back, okay, belonging to the state, which was taken some time since by George Dawson in the pirate brig called the Hope. Okay, well, there was a maritime court in Boston. It was decided that, yes, the Independence was a prize, that the state would get 50%, and the rest would go to the captain who brought in the vessel. His name was William Brown. What happened to the Independence after that? I have no idea. Did they rebuild it? Did they sell it to somebody else? I don't know. Did they use it for parts? I have no idea at all. Now, Sampson, after this time, served on 3 other Patriot ships, the last one being the Mars, which was also built here in Kingston, and I'm working on finding out about the Mars. Sampson lived for quite a while in Plymouth, and then he bought a farm in Plimpton, but only lived a year there, and he passed away. And he was brought back and buried on Burial Hill. And I think, I wonder if we have, I think we have his all right, that's his commission. We don't need to look at that. I'm sorry, oh, that's his sword. That's down at Pilgrim Hall. John Curtin led a photographer for a book at Newton. I go down into the basement and we opened up a box, and there was Captain Sampson's sword. And I looked at it and I said, "Ooh, I wouldn't want to run through with that. That's kind of a sharp, creepy sword, you know." Can we go and see if we can get down to the grave site? That's Halifax. There you go. And that's his grave site up on Burial Hill. It's quite beautiful, well preserved. Looks like it was made by a Kingston carver too. Bill Englishman, I think. That's my guess. All right. Now, all stories have something unexpected at the end of them. I have a little unexpected story to tell you about. Can you show me the next one, Nick? This is Jane Austen. Not the Jane Austen you're familiar with the E-N. That's Jane Goodwin Austen with the I-N. And she wrote these potboiler stories about Plymouth and, romances and all this kind of stuff. And she wrote a book called Dr. LeBaron and His Daughters, okay? Now, Jane was a historian herself, okay? She was related to a Goodwin, who was his name was Henry Goodwin. He was the captain's clerk on board the Independence. She may have had some good information here. When she passed away, in her obituary for the Daughters of the American Revolution, they said that her stories were not only full of interest, but historically correct. Maybe she is correct. Maybe if you could go on to the last one, I think. There's the book, and there's the silhouette. Oh, maybe that is the real silhouette. I mean, I don't know, but I'm not certain. So, and that's the book that I'm talking to you about. But the book is very romantic and very beautiful, and 2 parts I'll read to you, and then that'll be the end of my long and I hope not too tedious, story. His supposedly, according to, our author here, this is the story of the defeat of the Independence. "We can't get away upon the brigantine, Captain, without new rigging," reported the sailor master quietly, and the first lieutenant, clinging to the breech of a gun because he could not stand on a broken leg, gasped, "For God's sakes, Captain, don't throw away these men's lives. The boarders will be upon us in a moment, and there's nobody left to repel them." And from the captain's breast burst such a groan that they who heard it told it with awe to their children and their grandchildren. "Must we strike our flag? For the sake of these men, Captain. Why didn't they shoot me first? Quick, Captain!" Down came the Continental colors, while a shout of triumph went up from the decks of the ships, but was immediately repressed by orders of Dawson himself. "Captain Sampson, I am proud to be a home lawn boat," said the English officer, extending his hand. "I never saw a ship better worked or an engagement more bravely fought," said Dawson. "And yet, sir, my sword is yours," said Sampson bitterly, as he unbuckled it and gave it to him. "No, Captain, no," returned Dawson. "A man who can use a sword as you have should never be found." That's a little, come on, that's a little romanticized. But how about this one? This is a beautiful one. This is, she's telling us the story of off the Independence goes in the beginning. It was going on its first engagement. "Now has he ordered," meaning the captain, "his new ordinance to fire a triple salute. It was not for Sampson's wife and her fluttering kerchief, not even for the patriotic banner that he looked, nor for them, he thought. It was for the hundreds of brother men, every one of them, ready as he to die for their common country. It was to Kingston, his cradle, and Plymouth, the home of his manhood, that his glistening eyes turned, clenching the hilt of his sword. He muttered low, 'For my country, in life or death.' Then, as a small cold wind, straight from burying hill, filled the new sails of the warship, she made her stately way out of the harbor, past the Garnet." Have you any questions?
Sure.
Okay. Yes.
I'm just curious because this is the area that we live in, but the Drew shipyard, is there any indication how large of an operation that was in terms of land?
I really don't know. Is Pine here? I saw Pine. Oh, she left. Well, Pine Dubois would probably know, because she has maps. And, well, Jimmy, maybe you have an idea.
I would actually defer to Scott Bancroft, because we used to always say it was built at Jones River Landing, but
Yeah.
there's some. Our organizational belief is that the shipyard extended from Jones River Landing, where it currently is, up to Scott Bancroft's house. I've been trying my best to verify these things. A lot of the deeds are not conclusive, so
Right.
it's really hard to say.
They made a lot of boats, and they made big boats. Not as big as the Holmes boats, which came, in the 19th century. They made really big boats. But, yeah.
Yeah, it was quite small, could have been more than 3 acres.
Scott did a lot more research.
Yeah, I did some research on some of them.
Yeah.
21 landing roads, the ships that Kingston kind of describes it, and it sounds like 21 landing road was right there. Because my wife and I lived in Zena's Bruce house, and he was one of the family that actually built the boat. There were 5 brothers, Zenas, Cornelius, James. James was a master carpenter. William kind of owned the shipyard. He was they all have properties right around that area. One had a property up in the hill, another one on the corner of Village Street, that one the gate. So it's interesting. It's a family business, you know.
I would like to know more about ships being built, you know, before the revolution. You know, there were ships being built, I mean, not huge ships, but they were being built in the old days. But I know ships of Kingston doesn't go that far back, you know, it goes to where they have records, where we have records. Do you have any other questions? Yes.
Just a question about the boys.
Yeah.
The 7 boys that were on the Independence. Do you have any names of them, or whether they survived the battles, whether they were in prison, or whether they were released?
I'm sorry, I don't,
Boys.
the boys, I have the names of all the boys. One of them actually escaped, by the way. One of them was able to escape the ship and make it to Machias' name and survive.
They were the powder boys. They
Yeah.
got the powder and the shot out from the magazine of the wall.
That's how the monkeys, sorry.
To all the cannon.
God bless them. Can you imagine the service of a kid?
Wonder if they got any pensions.
Again, you know, I would love to go, I can go through pension records, but it takes such a long time. And you can do it on Ancestry.com.
Wasting any pensions.
Yeah, if I can find them, I would check the records, but that's very interesting to think about what it must have been like. It was bad enough for an adult to be involved in this kind of stuff, you know?
Tom, do we know, do we know the length of the brigantine?
The length?
The length, yeah, 120 tons, you said.
Not sure. You know, I may have that record at home, but I don't think it's in my book.
And just one thing under the scale of the shipyard, back to Scott's and Jimmy's comments, that the Drew Yard and those after that, today's modern landing road is actually moved down the hill significantly. The old landing road is the driveway of the Bradford house through the woods up the hill, especially in the winter. So where landing road is today was the Drew shipyard, parts of it, and then later homes and others. So that gives you a little sense of the scale maybe of the operations.
Thank you.
And you had questions on the order?
Okay, so did you guys have an Irish ship was taken on Independence? Did I get that right?
Yes, yeah.
So Ireland would not be the Ireland we know and love. Would they sail under the say, what is an Irish ship, given that it was part
Well,
of?
they would go to Ireland, whether it was a ship or they were going to Ireland, and they went to.
So it was Irish, but that it was out of Ireland, but it was also from the United Kingdom. That's the question. I know I'm kind of splitting hairs, because the Irish are not known for their million per se.
Well, you know, the businesses were probably owned by Englishmen. I mean, the ownership, you have to be quite healthy.
Well, maybe they could run a Guinness-all. They were running that good Guinness-all here.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, we were staffs.
You can get it today.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, I think in deference to Nick, I think we should conclude. And if you have any further questions, see me before you leave. And yes, Thomas.
I was getting ready to clap.
Okay.